So hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming for the sixth lecture of our commemorative series of Conference of the Work of John Rawls. Actually, it's not the sixth anymore. I think it's the seventh or eighth. Anyway, I'm Professor Daniel Simon Nascimento, one of the organizers of the event and the host for this meeting. So today we have with us Professor William Edmundson from the Georgia State University. Professor Edmundson is the author of several books on political philosophy, one of which is particularly interesting for our course, which is titled John Rawls, Reticent Socialist. So I believe his lecture will be a nice complement to the first lecture we had, which was by Professor Nian Heshie, who actually is an advocate of a complete different interpretation of John Rawls' work. But today now we have here with us, finally, Professor Edmundson. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor. Welcome to our humble event. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, for the wonderful introduction. If it's all right, I will share my screen and read through the paper that I prepared for this commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of John Rawls' Theory of Justice. It's titled Plutocracy and Polyarchy. And I need to make some adjustments to my screen so I can see the text. Plutocracy and Polyarchy. If these are unfamiliar terms, I will explain them as we go. The electoral pageant. Election follows election all across the globe, yet democracies are now said to be threatened and in decline. Populism is the usual suspect, but what is populism if not popular rule? And what is popular rule if not democracy? Democracy threatens itself? Not an absurd idea. Aristotle thought demagogy was democracy's fate. Who among us has not had that thought too, if only to put it aside? An orderly succession of governors by free, contested popular elections is the most conspicuous element of democracies. To the end of maintaining domestic tranquility across regime changes, this is arguably democracy's most valuable element. Even so, an obsessive emphasis on this one element neglects other, at least equally vital elements of democracy. The mediagenic pageantry of electoral contestation disguises the causes and nature of our contemporary democratic malaise. The installation of democratic elements had an important role in the genesis of nations and nationhood. Benedict Anderson describes events in the Americas whose European reflections crystallized the modern conception of what a nation must be. Out of the American welter came these imagined realities: nation states, republican institutions, common citizenships, popular sovereignty, national flags and anthems, etc., and the liquidation of their conceptual opposites: dynastic empires, monarchical institutions, absolutisms, subjecthoods, inherited nobilities, serfdoms, ghettos, and so forth. These revolutions provided a repeatable template for nationalist literate classes around the world. Although the model was a complex composite, it imposed certain standards from which too marked deviations were impermissible. Central among these was the expansion of the suffrage to include at least minimally competent adult person, every at least minimally competent adult person over whom the state claimed a right to rule as a subject. The continuity of a nation over time no longer consisted in more or less disorderly successions within or across dynastic bloodlines, but on more or less orderly sequence of what a cynic might call popularity contests, or what or as David Graeber and David Wingrove have put it, a variation on old aristocratic contests and prizes has come to be relabeled as democracy, most often in the form of national elections. This is the kind of thinking behind Joseph Schumpeter's minimalist declaration that, quote, the democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. Or in short, democracy is just a system in which the rulers are selected by competitive elections. The Chinese riposte to the Biden administration's recent Summit for Democracy begins by touting the transition facilitating function of the PRC's, quote, whole process, people's democracy, close quote. Constitutional monarchies draw upon both modes of temporal continuity. Popular contests pick the next government, while matrimony, genetics, and birth order determine who was the ceremonial head of state. A standard form of the electoral ritual emerged. It is often stated in terms of citizens' rights. As John Rawls summarized a half century ago in A Theory of Justice, quote, we may take for granted that a democratic regime presupposes freedom of speech and assembly and liberty of thought and conscience. End of quote. For the public political form to be genuinely free and open to all, further conditions, however, must be met. Quote, all citizens should have a fair chance to add proposals to the agenda for political discussion. At this point, Rawls dropped a footnote directing the reader to C. R.A. Dahl, A Preface to Democratic Theory, pages 67 through 75, for a discussion of the conditions necessary to achieve political equality. In the cited passage, Robert Dahl, the Yale political theorist, describes what he called polyarchy, which we should see as democracy itself in its quintessential sense. Democracy is a condition of political equality among the governed, existing at each of three distinct periods of the process of government. This is what Rawls meant by, quote, the basic essentials of a democratic regime, end quote. And although these essentials admit of variation, any comprehensive moral doctrine rejecting them outright counts as unreasonable. Dahl's three periods. In the first pre-voting period, each member of a democratic polity or a representative is equally free to add an alternative to the decision-making agenda and equally free to engage in debate. In the second voting period, each member or representative has an equal vote, and the issue is decided by majority rule. In the third post-voting period, the decision of the majority is implemented. Dahl was realistic. In the actual world, he wrote, the only stage at which polyarchy is closely approximated seems to be during vote counting. This middle period or stage is the only one with which most of us have any direct acquaintance. That acquaintance is often vivid in memory. Most voters, I suspect, remember which leader they voted for most recently. Someone who told us he could not remember whether he voted for or against Bolsonaro in 2018, or for or against Clinton in 2016, or for or against Boris Johnson in 2019 would surely be having us on. Even before the age of electronic media, election campaigns for high office were not only newsworthy, but often sources of entertainment. Now that we are well into the age of 24-hour televised news and social media, millions of voters compulsively consume political video clips, polls, and tweets for a quick hit of amusement or annoyance. Commentators in the United States are alarmed to find that the steady presidential Olympiad is suddenly not as dependable as before. Partisan state legislatures have been busy. They are applying the latest artificial intelligence algorithms to 2020 census data for the purpose of maximizing winnable districts. This is called gerrymandering, while also tightening voting qualifications and tinkering with the methods of vote casting and vote tabulating. In some states, authority to conduct and oversee the voting process is being transferred to reliable partisans. Ballots are suspected of appearing and voting machines suspected of flipping. Ballots need to be found to confirm what is independently known to be the true outcome. Skepticism about the fidelity of electoral outcomes is suddenly rampant. Tens of millions believe the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Armed private militias are forming across the United States to overturn the anticipated 2024 repetition of the steal, also known as the big lie in the centrist media. All of this is properly a subject of concern, but it's also a diversion from a deeper and subtler malady. The electoral spectacle could continue and yet remain fundamentally and thus utterly undemocratic. If there were nothing more to democracy than elections, any despot could claim to be a Democrat by the simple expedient of holding a sham plebiscite. Here is Dahl writing in the depths of the Cold War. What we balk at in accepting the vote of the Soviet citizen is that he is not permitted to choose among all the alternatives that we regard as potentially available. But if he could schedule the alternatives to include a vote against the ruling slate with no foreseeable punishment, then we are more likely to accept the outcome as democratic. Stalin is supposed to have said that what matters is not who casts the ballots, but who counts the ballots. Apocryphal. Stalin was shrewd enough to grasp that what really matters is who decides what gets printed on those ballots before they are cast. A wide franchise and accurate county cannot make democratic an election from which the people's preferred choice is effectively excluded. Dahl noted that his critique of the rigged Soviet pre-voting stage could extend to his own country, where, I quote, in the pre-voting stage, superior wealth and control over organizational resources so greatly exaggerate the power of the few that the social processes leading up to voting may properly be spoken of as highly undemocratic, although less so than in a dictatorship. To take one more recent example, of respondents to US polling, a vast majority, roughly 70%, supports adopting a single-payer healthcare system, aka Medicare for all. Nevertheless, the Democratic Party leadership consistently excludes such a program from the national legislative agenda, while simultaneously raking in money contributions from private health insurance and pharmaceutical industries. Despite their greater numbers, those who prefer single payer and a host of similar welfare state programs lose out to the wealthy and connected few with a stake in obstructing them. The many do not lose the vote. A vote is never taken. Plutocracy or polyarchy. Dahl lamented that Henry Luce, the Rupert Murdoch of his day, has 1,000 or 10,000 times greater control over the alternatives scheduled for debate and tentative decision at a national election than I do. Marx had observed over a century earlier that, quote, the contradiction that exists between the practical political power of the Jew and his non-existent political rights is the contradiction between politics and the power of money in general. Although theoretically, the former is superior to the latter, in actual fact, politics has become the serf of financial power. Rawls, far more than any of his contemporaries, was alive to the fundamental difficulty of liberal democracies, which is the difficulty of reconciling the contradiction between economic inequality and political equality. Many, like Rawls, recognize that strict economic equality is irreconcilable with basic liberties of association and occupational choice. But few have affirmed the strict priority of political equality over economic liberty, as Rawls did. Some liberals adopted a personal responsibility line. If you're powerless, it's your fault. For Rawls, if you're politically powerless, unlike the wealthy, there's something faulty with the basic structure of your society. It is unjust. Some contemporaries of Rawls took a "the rising tide raises all boats" line. A rational actor willingly trades away political equality in return for a greater total package of primary goods. Political inequality can be redeemed by greater wealth across all classes. And the politically less powerful have no just complaint if they're having greater relative power would make them worse off, all goods considered. Pair the personal responsibility line with the raise all boats line, and you have the kernel of a neoliberal political philosophy. Isn't the neoliberal line, though, simply following the logic of Rawls's own difference principle? It is not. Rawls emphatically rejected the difference principle as a first principle or a prior principle. The difference principle is plausible only in case background justice is assured by the installation of the first principle liberties. And among these, political equality alone must be of equal worth to all, regardless of differences of wealth and income. As Rawls emphasized in his later writings, the difference principle standing alone permits relative economic inequality to grow without limit. A prior commitment to political equality is necessary to lend the difference principle the appeal it has as the benchmark against which to judge the way the basic structure distributes wealth and income. Contrary to the neoliberal line, political influence cannot be treated as simply one good among others. Greater demand for beer leads to more and cheaper beer. Greater demand for political influence does not lead to more and cheaper for all, but the reverse. For that reason, among others, Rawls insisted on what he called the fair value of the equal political liberties. Obviously, people show different levels of political competence, resulting from different degrees of interest in political and public issues, and different degrees of aptitude in reasoning and judgment. At equal levels of political competence, however, all should have equal political influence. That is the polyarchic ideal. Formal democracy fails to halt rising economic inequality. Merely formal political equality gives no Rawlsian fair value guarantee of effective political equality. Can contested elections reduce economic inequality anyway? Adam Przeworski finds that, quote, at every level of per capita income, the extent of inequality is not lower in democracies than in autocracies. Across a range of different, at least minimal democracies, Low levels of economic inequality tend to call forth mitigating efforts to dampen further inequality, but high inequality leads to ever higher inequality. Przeworski concludes that the main culprit is that people are not politically equal in economically unequal societies, despite the polity being formally democratic. Merely formal political equality does not prevent massive inequality of political influence in conditions of high economic inequality. And as substantive political inequality increases, so too does the economic inequality that begat it, a vicious circle. Can the election habit still perform the service promised by minimal democracy, that of orchestrating the orderly succession of governments? Rawls denied that such a polity could be stable for the right reasons, but could it be stable anyway? Przeworski believes so long as the stakes are not too high for the incumbent. Where the incumbent, quote, fears that if he loses the forthcoming election, he will exit the office through a window, end quote, he or she will be inclined to use the formidable powers of office to avoid electoral loss and its further consequences. Competitive elections presuppose more than tolerating oppositions. They also presuppose that the incumbent may safely yield power. Ordinary, minimally democratic politics has to be low stakes politics if it is to work. Once the election habit has taken hold, it becomes stronger with each cycle. The outs know their turn will come, and the ins know that if turned out, they will be allowed to win themselves back in. So long as the popular majority also retains its faith in a better life for itself and its progeny, the electoral stakes may stay manageably low for all, and the election habit strengthens with repetition. But as Przeworski notes, confidence in the intergenerational progress is eroding in the democracies. And his analysis suggests a latent dilemma. The opposition, to be genuine, must give voice to discontent. And to be effective, it must stoke discontent. But the election habit is based on an unspoken promise of amnesty for the incumbent rascal, however corrupt. Otherwise, an incumbent who faces prison for perceived crimes will self-defensively misuse the incumbent's advantages to rig, if not abort, the election process. Where amnesty is the norm, as it must be to keep the stakes low, elections can do little to check top-level official corruption and simony, which can be expected to increase unless a breaking point exists. Appeasing bullies and wrongdoers only encourages more of the same, writes Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe. Once the amnesty norm is breached, however, elections cease to be the low-stakes affairs that orderly transitions of power presuppose. The disposition of merely minimal democracy is to ratchet toward that breaking point. The election habit in Brazil and the United States. Brazil and the United States make an interesting comparison. Despite their uniquenesses, the two vast American nations share certain qualities. Slavery of Africans figures in the history of both places. So does cultural amnesia about racism's persistence. Although their economies are quite unlike, both are among the economically most unequal populous countries. The US population is only 50% larger than Brazil's, while the US economy is over 10 times the size. Nevertheless, both countries have a high level of social media addiction and a growing trend toward evangelical Protestantism. Each of the two countries exhibits a kind of American exceptionalism. As Perry Anderson writes, only the US, behind its ocean moats and conviction of divine preference, approaches Brazil in its degree of introversion. There are both similarities and differences in their respective modes of self-centeredness. While the US is the global hegemon, Brazil is no more than a major and not quite a great power. The US maintains titanic thermonuclear and conventional arsenals and 800 foreign military installations. Yet, at least since the Civil War of 1861 to 65, the US military has never been an actor in domestic politics. By contrast, the Brazilian military is puny and faces inward, not outward. But, Anderson writes, what it lacks in external throw weight, it makes up for in domestic strike capacity. Not aggression abroad, but repression at home has been its great vocation. This difference affects how the transition facilitating function of elections looks in the two places. In Brazil, popular former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was prosecuted and imprisoned for a year and a half for alleged corruption while in office. A precedent for jailing a former chief executive has been set, not as a sequel to a military coup d'etat, but as the outcome of an anti-corruption initiative led by the judiciary, a role utterly foreign to the US judiciary. Currently, there are calls in the Brazilian Congress for the incumbent, former Army Captain Jair Bolsonaro, to be punished for his mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic. Brazil is second only to the United States in the number of COVID fatalities. Bolsonaro standing for re-election is, for him and his associates, a high-stakes affair. Brazilian chief executives whose terms end must now worry whether the exit from the presidential office is also the doorway to a prison cell. It is no surprise that Bolsonaro and his military allies in the government have begun preemptively to stoke doubts about the possibility of a fair result in the upcoming presidential election. Removal from office is one thing, doing time in a penitentiary is another. The United States has until lately operated under a more tranquil precedent, which was set by Gerald Ford's pardon of his predecessor, Richard Nixon. The pardon may have cost Ford an electoral loss, but the 1976 winner, Jimmy Carter, showed not a trace of interest in punishing Nixon any further. Many of Nixon's underlings did do time. Nixon's pardon was effective only against federal charges, but no state prosecutions or even criminal investigations took place, despite the existence of probable cause to believe that Nixon had committed crimes punishable in the states where he maintained residences. Along came Donald Trump. Until the Trump versus Hillary Clinton contest in 2016, the United States seemed to be on the safe, low-stakes road in contrast to high-stakes Brazil. Despite polls showing him trailing, Trump repeatedly declared that only massive electoral fraud could prevent his winning. At his rallies, Trump smiled approvingly as his supporters chanted, "Lock her up." In televised debate with Clinton, Trump declared, "If I win, I am going to instruct my attorney general to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation." Once in office, however, Trump seems never to have issued such instruction. Trump was twice impeached during his term, but could not be removed. So far, subsequent to his grudging exit from office in January 2021, no criminal charge has been brought against him, either federally or in any state. Yet suspicion of Trumpian criminality, both in office and prior to taking it, is well-founded. Trump himself preemptively declared that his presidential power to pardon extended to include a pardon of himself, by himself. And this was prior to his remarkable attempts to influence election officials in Georgia, where I live, insisting that they find the numbers of votes he needed to overtake Joe Biden. To say nothing of his inciting an insurrectionary riot on January 6, 2021. The Ford pardon of Nixon nicely illustrates Przeworski's thesis that the security of the election habit depends to some degree on setting a comfortable cushion underneath a departing incumbent. The imprisonment of Lula must now weigh heavily on Bolsonaro's mind. Similarly, the forbearance shown so far toward Donald Trump may reflect a prosecutorial judgment that the value of keeping the stakes low for the electoral transition at the presidential level outweighs the rule of law value of punishing official criminality. The cases of France and Israel have been cited for the proposition that prosecuting ex-leaders is no big deal. I think maybe we can discuss this afterwards. This is new material we haven't had a chance to see. There are differences that make Israel and France cases not closely analogous to those of Brazil and the United States. Rawls tried to show that a society ordered according to its two principles of justice was stable, and stable for the right reasons. A well-ordered democracy is one in which inevitable injustices tend to be corrected because citizens and their representatives consult a shared set of principles. In such a democracy, order is maintained primarily by citizens' shared confidence in the justness of their basic institutions, and only secondarily by the threat of coercion and punishment. Neither Brazil nor the United States can claim to be well-ordered in this sense. Many will say that the Rawlsian brand of democracy is utopian, and that it is more realistic to get behind a functioning minimal democracy with its electoral rituals to assure continuity, despite de facto plutocratic rule. Przeworski's observations and recent developments in the two countries cast doubt on the stability of minimal democracy in either place. Brazil is fortunate in having had a strong and, for a time at least, genuine Workers' Party. The United States, by contrast, does not have and never has had such a party. The world would be a more hopeful place if, in this respect at least, the global hegemon were more similar to Brazil. Political spending is political speech. Political spending is political speech and is entitled to constitutional protection as such, at least according to the US Supreme Court's decision in the Buckley versus Vallejo case. Rawls, this was decided 5 years after the publication of A Theory of Justice. Rawls despaired of the plutocratic two-party duopoly that rules the United States. It is a kind of system unlike Brazil's unruly multitude of political parties, while also resembling it in that parties in both countries serve largely as mere campaign and campaign financing vessels, or is the PT an exception? Rawls placed his hopes for the US in the emergence of a third or even fourth national party. The practicality of this, however, depended upon third-party voters also having the ability to vote for a candidate of one of the two major parties at the voting stage. Otherwise, a third-party candidate cannot easily escape the stigma of being a mere spoiler, ruining the chances of the lesser evil of the majority of the major party candidates. As to this day, Ralph Nader is blamed for the 2000 victory of George W. Bush over Al Gore. Rawls quietly supported the passage of laws allowing minor party endorsements to appear on ballots, so-called fusion candidacies, such as the law that allowed the Liberal Party endorsement to appear next to Republican John Lindsay's name in the 1965 New York mayoral race. Sadly, the New York Democratic Party under Andrew Cuomo's direction has succeeded in raising the bar for minor parties to access the ballot. Rawls's hope was dashed by the US Supreme Court decision in Timmons versus Twin Cities Area New Party, which held that a legislature in the grip of a party duopoly may legitimately take steps intended to consolidate its rule by, as in that case, insisting that only a single party affiliation per candidate be shown on ballots. Stability is a constitutional value, the court declared, and a legislature may judge that the transition facilitating function of elections takes precedence over other values, such as representation and freedom of political speech. Material rather than merely formal political equality is not a constitutional value at all, according to the US Supreme Court. The Biden administration blithely internalizes these ground rules. How else to make sense of the inclusion of the following session in the US State Department's 2021 Summit for Democracy? I won't read this. It would crack me up. I would start laughing. The multiplicity of veto points in the US constitutional structure, combined with the paucity of limits on moneyed influence, mean that business interests effectively have a veto over what can be put to a vote. The threat and reality of capital flight, combined with ex parte lobbying at the third stage, the post-election stage, break the implementation of popular regulatory measures that manage to make it into law. Seen from a late Rawlsian point of view, this obsessing exclusively over the middle stage furthers an ideology in the service of an unjust and unworthy status quo. The endless campaign circus disguises the massive inequality of influence at the agenda setting and rule of law stages. The firm habit of deciding US governments by electoral contests has disguised the fact that the nation has been and remains what Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig calls a minoritarian democracy. Rawls's objection to such a conception of democracy resonates today. There is no publicly acceptable way of selecting which minority is to rule. In practice, the wealthy rule here, a circumstance that destroys any pretense of there being any public conception of justice to appeal to in opposing laws, and legal disabilities that obstruct the making of law, which are seriously unjust. Rawls wrote, and I quote, "At some point, the injustice of the outcomes of the legitimate democratic procedure corrupts its legitimacy. And so will the injustice of the political constitution itself. Evidently, tens of millions of Americans speak and behave as though that point had been reached. They do not believe their voices matter and do not believe that their government speaks for them." Rawls again, I quote, "Political authority is not mysterious, nor is it to be sanctified by symbols and rituals citizens cannot understand in terms of their common purposes. Without background justice, the electoral ritual and its symbols become a sham. Background justice must always answer to," this is Rawls, "our considered judgments with their fixed points, such as the condemnation of slavery and serfdom, religious persecution, the subjection of the working classes, the oppression of women, and the unlimited accumulation of vast fortunes." A re-democratization of the United States is overdue, a democratic reset. Like severe good parents, Brazil's re-democratization followed a period of military rule, as did Portugal's. Astoundingly, voices on the left have recently suggested that a military laundering might suit the US, as the only way to get rid of 2.5 centuries of accumulated plutocratic gum. Here's a recent exchange between left heavy heads Matt Chrisman and Slavoj Zizek. Chrisman, sometimes I think that our only real hope is some sort of free officers movement in the US military, because the US military really is the only institution in America that has legitimacy and power. Zizek, what do you mean by free officers? I didn't get it. Chrisman, a movement of like middle officers in the United States military deciding essentially to seize control of the American economic system in an emergency capacity rather than just allow liberal capitalism to produce itself into oblivion. Zizek, this is a wonderful idea. I love you. You cannot even imagine to what extent you touch my deep proletarian heart, I think. But on the other hand, you know that these middle officers are very ambiguous creatures. I hope the United States is an exception here, but in Chile, Pinochet, and you have quite often the opposite situation where the whole army is relatively enlightened. The middle officers can be new right, neo-fascist, and so on. But this idea, yes, I immediately, because I support it, you know. Why? Because even if in reality the army is interconnected with economy and civil life, but nonetheless, you're at some kind of symbolic distance. You have a minimum of distance towards the madness of economic political life. My God, I will use this. Somehow taking control, like severe good parents saying, sorry guys, you screwed it up. We will just have some minimal standards. And I don't care if this happens. Sometimes it has to be done. And anybody who comes, I don't care who it is. I was always against this demonization of the army as if they are automatically fascist. There are progressive interventions of state forces, but I like your idea, especially for the obvious reason that it will be so shocking for the wide public. Look, the United States, the greatest democracy in the world of all times, only a military coup d'etat can say that. Because of this neo-tribalism and so on, what you already have in the United States is a de facto state of civil war. The action can only come from somebody who is strictly neutral. Neutral, not really, no one is neutral, but in the formal sense of the professional position, standing outside this direct conflict. Yes, frankly, I don't see any other force in the army here. It is horrible what we are saying today. Laughter. Chrisman, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. That's a more realistic path than any kind of mass movement in the US. Zizek, a very good idea. They, the officers, did try to push revolution a little bit further, but when it didn't go, they very honorably stepped back. They did it. My God, they did it. They did it, not the political opposition. Now, what role the Portuguese army's middle officers had in the Carnation Revolution and what the enduring successes of it were are debated subjects. The present, far more dubious question is whether anyone in the US Officer Corps could possibly be reading from the same relatively enlightened page. Brazil's seems not to be. Surely by coincidence, within weeks of Chrisman and Zizek's podcast, 3 retired US generals opined in the Washington Post that the military had better get ready. It could well be called upon to resist a civilian coup in 2024. These ex-generals' primary concern is that the unity of the military might suffer. The idea of rogue units organizing amongst themselves to support the rightful commander-in-chief cannot be dismissed, where rightful is in scare quotes. The Justice Department ought to show more urgency in making an example of the January 6th insurrectionists, but the military cannot wait for elected officials to act. The Pentagon should immediately order a civics review for all members, uniformed and civilian, on the Constitution and electoral integrity. There must also be a review of the laws of war and how to identify and deal with illegal orders. And they must reinforce unity of command to make perfectly clear to every member of the Defense Department whom they answer to. No service member should say they didn't understand whom to take orders from during a worst case scenario. Do the generals let slip that the rightful commander in case of a disputed 2024 presidential election can be anybody but Trump? All service members take an oath to protect the US Constitution, but in a contested election when loyalty split, some might follow orders from the rightful commander in chief, while others might follow the Trumpian loser. If the result in 2024 is really murky and violently disputed, should the military leadership take over and run the show for a while, as per Christman and Zizek's proposal? Would the civics review the three generals, ex-generals call for even address the question? Kick restarting the election habit. On the face of it, Rawls would be an unlikely source to appeal to defend any kind of domestic military initiative to reboot the democratic process. Yet Rawls, like any political philosopher, will allow that resistance to an established order, even a minimally democratic order, is sometimes justifiable. He wrote, "When a society is regulated by principles favoring narrow class interests, one may have no recourse but to oppose the prevailing conception of justice and the institution it justifies in such ways as promise some success." Rawls backhandedly admitted that he lacked a developed theory of transition to a just society, and also that he would allow the temporary suspension of civil and political rights when that was essential to accomplishing the transition. If such means can be justified, how can the military be ruled out a priori as the agency to manage them? Of course, it's a crazy path to suggest seeking out from where we are right now. But if events were to plop us down someplace where we find the generals already in charge, a different question is presented. What would we wish the officers' civic education to have covered? As to the general question of revolution, Rawls wrote, "Here, of course, we have to balance imponderables. How great must the likelihood of success be? How unjust the regime, and much else. These questions have no precise answers and depend, as one says, on judgment. Political philosophy cannot formulate a precise procedure of judgment, and this should be expressly and repeatedly stated." In 1985, the Brazilian military allowed Brazil to begin to re-democratize. But this was only after 2 decades marked by atrocious suppression by the dictatorship it had installed. What was it about the Portuguese military that made its almost bloodless intervention so successful? True enough, the Carnation Revolution ended a half-century of strongman autocracy and 13 years of colonial warfare. These in themselves were undoubtedly moves in the right direction. Its equally great achievement, however, as Zizek points out, consisted in knowing when to let go. Should it happen that the US military steps in to settle the 2024 election, the worry should not be that its intervention will be bloody and prolonged, but that the military will hurriedly let go without accomplishing anything. What is demanded is a new, genuinely democratic constitution for the US. In 1976, Portugal got one. Brazil got one in 1988. Chile is getting one. It's past time for the US to get one. But how? There's no real chance that a constitutional convention can succeed under the constraints of Article 5 of the US Constitution of 1787-91. The ratification of each change would be subject to veto by the legislatures of any subset numbering 13 of the 50 states, representing perhaps as little as 4% of the US population. Or can the Article 5 bottleneck be repurposed as a gateway? Article 5 does allow 2/3 of the state legislatures, i.e. 34, to call a constitutional convention. Once such a body convenes and takes its task to be one of forming a more perfect union, it might audaciously stipulate a new and utterly different mode of ratifying the product of its deliberations. That is essentially what happened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Only thereafter, and by the very mode the framers prescribed, did the people exercise their constituent power to reformulate their social contract. To achieve political equality in the United States, Lessig favors a constitutional convention that is bound by Article 5 in statute. To ease popular anxiety about where such a convention might lead, he looks not to Portugal, but to Mongolia for inspiration. Let there be a statute forming advisory shadow constitutional juries totaling 2,500 randomly chosen conscripts. Not a bad idea, especially if contentious issues like gun rights, abortion rights, and school prayer are referred to the citizens' juries, much as the 1789 framers deferred action on a Bill of Rights until after settling on basic issues of institutional design. Lessig rightly dismisses as bunk the fear that a convention called under Article 5 might itself exercise the constituent power and ipso facto be released from the constraints of that article. Rightly viewed, the framers of 2025 need no more presume to exercise the constituent power than did the framers of 1787. The framers of 1787 did, however, exceed their remit from the Confederation Congress, not only with respect to its scope, but also crucially as to the mode of ratification. Yet the people were understood throughout to possess the constituent power and to have to exercise it as stipulated by the framers by acting through the legislatures or conventions of the respective states. Only 9 states needed to assent for all 13 to be bound. Why? The framers said so. The framers of 2025 need no more bind themselves to Article 5's assurance of the state's equal suffrage in the Senate than the framers of 1787 who drafted it. How are the delegates of this convention to be chosen, and what is to be the mode of ratification? For appointment, it would be best to hew as closely as possible to Article 5 as circumstances will allow. As for ratification, I suggest it might be wise to put the new constitution to a national referendum administered not by the states, but by a good severe parent. Any manner of fresh appeal to the constituent power is a radical idea, of course, even without military involvement. But to conscript Jürgen Habermas's challenge to Rawls, how else are we to, quote, reignite the radical embers of the original position in civic life? Rawls took Habermas's point. Quote, the ideal of a just constitution is always something to be worked toward. And he quoted Habermas approvingly. The democratic constitutional state does not represent a finished structure, but is delicate and above all fallible and reversible undertaking whose purpose is to realize the system of rights anew in changing circumstances, that is, to institutionalize it more appropriately and to draw out its contents more radically. This was on the supposition of an already just constitutional basic structure, and so these remarks apply a fortiori in less favorable circumstances in which a transition to a just society is needed and shows some promise of success. Conclusion. The passage from 2021, the centenary of Rawls's birth, to 2022, the 2-decade mark since his death, is slipping by almost unnoticed in our crisis-torn, doom-tormented age. The so-called democracies have shown themselves barely able to protect public health and unwilling to take steps to avoid the unfolding catastrophe of global heating. Are these failures fairly traceable to the lack of real democracy, or rather to something wrong at a deeper level? I don't know. Rawls was well acquainted with human-generated catastrophe and was among the first thinkers seriously to tackle the problem of justice between generations. It was certainly his belief that the worthwhile perpetuation of our species hangs upon the justice of our institutions and those normal conditions under which human cooperation is both possible and necessary. Cooperation on both a local and global scale is evidently more necessary now than ever. Whether it is possible or not, we shall soon discover.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the very enlightening presentation. We've been working here, me, Bruno, and Ulysses, on the questions that we have for you. We have added a few questions, a few more questions, and we have reordered them. Yes, you would like to say?
Perhaps we could take a break of maybe 5 minutes before,
that is
before
perfect.
resuming.
5 minutes?
5 minutes.
10 minutes? Five is okay?
5's good.
Okay, 5 minutes then. Everybody, 3 o'clock, 3:05, we're back.
3 or
So I wrote here in the chat, everybody who would like to ask questions, they can write in the chat, raise their hands, and I will see the word to them. But I'll start, like we reorder the questions a bit, those I sent to you in order to make room for the newer ones, which I think are more interesting in a lot of ways because they deal more directly with the issues that the text arouses. So I think I'll share my screen too, so that you can read them and avoid, any misunderstanding problems. So this is it. You can see them now?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I can see.
So this first question is the biggest question, and we broke it down into several sub questions in order to make it a little easier and clearer. So basically, when you say that inequality of resources in the pre-voting stage makes our voting process highly undemocratic, you describe an antidote and you say, okay, so we need constitutional reform. This is the main proposal of the text, and this is something that it rings a bell here for us. Some of us are calling for this in Brazil for quite a while now, but a lot of us are fearful of that for several reasons. So a lot of our questions have to do with that, I think, with some of the fears we have and wanting to know whether or not you share those fears. But this first question is more a rousing question. It's about how to ground this call for constitutional reform in a country like the US and like Brazil, because we're not sure, so we'd like to see what are the arguments that you have, and how do you read Rawls about this? So you say that the reason we have to do this is because political liberties cannot be treated simply as one liberty among the rest, one set of liberty among the rest. But this is a controversial thesis. I mean, even you recognize that it can be rational for someone to trade, political liberties for a package of greater primary goods. And Stephen Rawls has recently argued that there is no necessary link between the fair value of political liberties and a just political process or the establishment of just legislation. And the Rawls erred in attaching the kind of importance he did to political liberty. Now, we know you disagree with that, but we'd like you to expand a little more on this argument for our benefit and the benefit of our students here, telling us a little more about what separates political equality from the other primary goods and the reasons why you think that we should value them above all others.
Yeah, that's a very central question. I think Rawls's distinctive contribution to political philosophy will turn out to have been the establishment of political equality as a prior value. And it enjoys a certain priority even among the equal basic liberties, in that political equality alone among the equal basic liberties is to be guaranteed its equal worth. across different classes of society at a given level of motivation and aptitude for engagement in politics. If you take away the fair value guarantee, I think the whole Rawlsian edifice collapses into a kind of what I call neoliberal type of theory. So what's the argument for, and what's the argument in the original position procedure that establishes the fair value guarantee for the equal political liberties and those liberties alone? I struggled with this subsequent to finishing the 2017 book on Rawls, John Rawls, Reticent Socialist, because I thought, yeah, if you accept that political equality in this vigorous sense has this prior position in the principles of justice, then that will take you some places that where it takes you will depend on history, where you find yourself in history. But how do we establish that the political liberties are entitled to this kind of importance? Why aren't they just primary goods among other primary goods? And so I read Stephen Wall's paper and a number of other papers that had tried to reconstruct Rawls's argument. Wall, I think, was a little bit dismissive. As I recall, his arguments seemed to be that the question whether wealth conveys political advantages is an empirical one, and as an empirical question, it's an answer is not available to choosers in the original position. Now, saying that controverting something does not automatically make it controversial. Political philosophers really throughout history, and I include Aristotle here, have acknowledged that wealth is easily translated into political power, political advantage. So one could argue about that, but to say what I've just said is not itself an argument. The remarks that Rawls makes in Theory of Justice are frankly both scattered and obscure. And so reconstruction is required. And so I wrote a paper which is now in print titled, "What is the argument for the fair value of the political liberties?" ? And I could read you that paper, but I'm not going to. I'm just joking. I wouldn't inflict that on you. But one of the difficulties in reconstructing Rawls's argument is that it seems to have something to do with self-respect, and I think that it's not absent. It's just that that's not what's bearing the weight. I think what bears the weight of the argument, when properly understood, is the significance of stability for the right reasons. A reasonable chooser in the original position will reject principles that he or she does not believe others are capable of adhering to. So there's a reasonableness requirement. And if we think of the significance of the political liberties, we have a beginning of an argument. And Rawls takes this through his two moral powers. I'll not try to recapitulate all that's in the article, because I think that trying to go through all the windings of Rawls's argument can tend to obscure what it's really getting at. We, in the original position, we know there are comprehensive conceptions of the good, but we don't know which one is ours. And we know that we might change over time, or in our lifetimes. We might decide, well, when I was young, I thought, celebrity, fame, influence was the most important thing in life. Now I'm older, I think that, bonding with a family or something else is different. Or I was born a Catholic, but now that I'm older, I'm attracted to Buddhism. Things like this are possibilities that are known to the choosers in the original position. And liberty must mean, liberty of conscience, most basically, means not just the liberty to select and adhere to a comprehensive conception of what life is about, what's good in life. It's also the liberty to change one's mind, to choose a different set of values without losing one's identity. And in the original position, the choosers are aware of the limited nature of social space, Rawls calls it, influenced here by Isaiah Berlin. Society a political society at any time and place is not going to be commodious enough to allow all conceptions of the good to flourish. Some will wither and die. We can think of ways of life that have died or are dying now. And we realize also, as a matter of general knowledge available to us in the original position, that political society has, I won't say everything to do, but has a great deal to do with what is accommodated at a given time and place in that social space, what lives it's possible to lead. And for that reason, a chooser in the original position will want to have as as much political power as possible, whatever situation he or she winds up in, and whatever set of values he or she happens to have chosen once the veil is lifted and one's position, one's identity is something one can consult in making judgments. Moreover, one is choosing not just for oneself, but as a, if you like, a head of a line of succession. I think he uses the term head of household at one point. So you're not just choosing for yourself. You're wanting to keep possibilities alive for your progeny. If you choose, you might choose not to have any, but you don't know that behind the veil of ignorance. So for these reasons, a rational person would want to have as much influence over political decisions as possible. But as a reasonable person, one would not demand more than a fully equal degree of influence over political decisions. And not knowing one's level of wealth or income or one's even one's conception of the good, one would insist, in fact, that things irrelevant to political competence not convey advantages in political influence. And why would you agree to that? Surely, of course, a reasonable person would want wise decisions to be made, but people disagree about who the wise people are. And so for these reasons, it would be rational to insist on a principle of fair political equality, fair valued political equality. Secondly, the stability dimension comes in. It's one can't commit to principles that one knows that others may reasonably reject. One can't commit to principles that one knows one can't live up to. And similarly, one can't commit to principles that one knows that others can't be counted upon to live up to. So even if one were willing to take a chance that unequal political influence could lead to better decisions, even if one, on the basis of really no evidence whatever, that success in business conveyed some sort of practical wisdom that could be converted into wise political judgments, one certainly would have no reason to expect others to agree with that. And so, given the importance of politics in shaping the social space, and given the irrelevance of one's share of wealth and income to political competence, choosers in the original position would insist upon fair valued political equality, not just formal political equality. Well, at the same time, and the point has been made that choosers might insist on fair value of other civil rights, like the right to a fair trial, for example. I think that's a good point. I mean, it doesn't damage Rawls's position. I mean, we can see actually from another angle the strength it has. One doesn't want the fairness of a criminal trial, say, in which one is the defendant, to depend on how good an attorney one can afford. One would like criminal punishment to be administered fairly, regardless of the wealth or income of the criminal defendant. And this is something I think that could be established additionally. But that doesn't mean that Rawls is now, for consistency's sake, going to have to insist upon the fair value of all the first principle equal basic liberties. I think it's quite clear that that if that were the case, then it would be damaging to Rawls's theory, in the sense that it would become more demandingly egalitarian than was his intention. His thought was that if you have, say, a religious faith that requires buying indulgences or going on expensive pilgrimages, then whether you're able to afford those things falls within the sphere of the principle of responsibility, just as any expensive taste one has. Politics cannot be treated as an expensive taste in a just society, is Rawls's view in a nutshell. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Professor. Okay, so our next questions here, they are two actually, and I think they are very much, in the same vein. So the first one begins with, wouldn't it be problematic? And the second one begins with, wouldn't it be dangerous? And I think that's where we start to formulate our fears here. The first one, the problematic question, asks whether or not in countries like the US, but also Brazil, I mean, do we have grounds to ask for constitutional reform when we do not see in these countries the population take the streets, as they did in Chile, for instance, asking for constitutional reform? And if this has not happened yet, shouldn't we recognize that the constitutions these countries have are anchored somehow in their public political culture? If we recognize that, to call for a reform, constitutional reform, wouldn't we fall in the same dilemma that Rawls was facing when he called for the difference principle? To say, okay, so this is anchored somehow in our public political culture, but at the same time, it is not. At the same time, there is something that is missing there. So this is the problematic version of the question. So the dangerous version of the question is I think, another one, which is this: people like me, and I think Bruno and Ulysses, and I think you too, when we call for a constitutional reform, we're not saying, you know what, our countries, they made their constitution so long ago, and it doesn't reflect anymore our values anymore, so we should hold a new one. And whatever comes out of it, that'll be fine. That will reflect our current values. No, we have a very specific result in mind when we say these would be desirable. So that's the thing. Right now, both US and Brazil are countries which are experiencing radical political divisions, and where a big part of the population and of the elected officials are publicly defending and advancing a reactionary agenda based on negationist arguments about issues such as global heating and the efficacy of vaccines. I mean, we're actually fighting about things today. We're fighting about things that we took to be perfectly obvious a few years ago. So don't you think that in this political climate, it would be dangerous to call for a new constitutional or a new constitutional reform? Because, I mean, how can you know what is going to come out of it, you know?
Yeah, that's a very good, tough question. Let me put it this way. There's a difference between calling for some crisis and, on the other hand, making plans for what to do in the event of such a crisis. Let me give you an example. In 2007, one might have been very unhappy with the political economic structure of, say, the United States. One might have thought it was seriously unjust. But that did not mean that one had to desire or welcome the global economic collapse that occurred in 2008. But it would have made sense to have thought in advance about what should we desire in case this crisis were to occur. And in fact, in the United States, the left had no preparation whatsoever. And so in a short period of time, the banks, the auto industry, the insurance industry, all became public property. They were all fell into public hands. They were all bailed out. We call it bailout, but essentially it's, taking in something and then giving it back, even though following strict rules of risk taking and capitalism. Then you lost it. General Motors, you're out of here. Well, rather than say keep the auto industry in public hands and shape it, say in the direction of eliminating carbon emissions, President Obama essentially just gave it back to the public sector. Gifts all round, bailouts all round, except for homeowners. So one might quite consistently say, in 2007, gee, I hope the global economy doesn't collapse because it's going to cause so much pain. But if it does, and we find the financial system, the automobile industry, and the insurance industry in public hands, let's keep them there for a while. Let's not rush to get rid of them. Okay? So in our present circumstances, I mean, there's so much doomsaying in the US. I hope you don't have as much of it in Brazil. But I mean, the editorial pages of the New York Times just sort of, society is coming apart. It may be going a little bit too far now, but there is a reason to worry that things politically are going to get so messy in the United States, if not in 2022, then in 2024, that it may be necessary to involve the military in some way in settling disputes. It's not something I would hope for. It was something it would be a terrible thing. And I hope it's not going to happen. I don't assign it that high a probability, but if it occurs, what do we want to happen? What's the plan in that case? What's plan B? for the progressive left, whatever you want to call it, in the United States, there was no plan B in 2008. As a result, we got Donald Trump. I think there's a fairly plausible case to be made for the proposition that the bailouts of the financial industry and the slow recovery from the 2008 debacle caused a great deal of unhappiness, caused it to focus, brought many causes, many things are coming together here. But because the left was clueless, you may recall the Occupy Wall Street movement in Zuccotti Park. Its theme was, what is our one demand? What? You're asking? Capitalism has just collapsed. You say, well, what do we want? What do we want now? Well, you better be prepared better than that next time. So if somehow the United States is in such confusion that the military has to involve itself in some way in how I can't imagine what they would do. Under the U.S. Constitution, what actually the many of the right wing hope will happen is to throw the calculations to throw the presidential election into Congress, which has special rules that would almost guarantee Republican victory. But to do that, they've got to create enough confusion in the various states. And of course, not everybody's going to just sit back and let this happen. So there's a reasonable chance that there will be some disorder. And it may be that such that the military would be called upon by whom. If there's a dispute about who the commander-in-chief is, then the generals writing in the Washington Post said, well, we need to be ready to tell who's the real president of the United States. Well, I mean, that's tantamount to if the military can choose the president of the United States, then we're in a Schmittian state of exception, no question. And the question is, how do we get out of it? Well, I mean, one approach would be say, well, let's just go back quickly, let's get back to normal as quickly as we can. We want normalcy. We must have normalcy. Well, was that the thinking in 2008, 2009? Is that what the guiding star of the Obama administration, which had a supermajority in the Senate, by the way, for 2 years to work with, and the most they could come up with was a huge gift to the private insurance industry called the Affordable Care Act, which failed. Tens of millions of people uncovered without any health insurance, but was a tremendous deal for the insurance companies that run these insurance exchanges or on the insurance exchanges. So, in short, I don't want the military involved at all. In a well-ordered society, the military has no role, none, in domestic politics. That's ideal theory. What about the non-ideal, which is where we live? We live in the non-ideal. And Rawls didn't do much there. Only one issue that he thrashed through extensively, which was civil disobedience. And the questions that I've brought up here are all matters of non-ideal theory. and what are we to do in non-ideal circumstances, as we were in 2008. So I hope that answers the question. I hope it's responsive to the question. No, I would much rather just muddle forward with all the imperfections, injustices, and try to mitigate them as much as possible. But there may very well come a point when things are so unstuck that one has to think, well, how do we want to come out of this? Where do we want to come out of this? And Matt Christman points to the Carnation Revolution as an example of how positively one might achieve a democracy with the out of the unlikely material of a military coup.
Okay, so on that note, the two last questions about this topic, can we do it now? Do you want to take a break again? So
yeah, let's take a little 2-minute break. Is that all right?
Okay, we can.
2 minutes.
Take a break.
Yeah.
So as you can imagine, whenever we talk of the military, it sends like shrills down our spine. So one of the questions we have for you is like, so thinking ahead then, in the event that something happens and we are faced with the possibility of constitutional reform, you say that we should submit the Constitution to a national referendum, and it should be administered not by the states, but by this figure, which is the good civil parents, the figure we took from the conversation between Zizek and the other author whose name I forgot now. But they talk about the military. We resisted that due to our recent history, and I imagine you do too. And we would ask, who exactly do you think should play the role of the good civil parent? That's the first question. And the second question is, how can a constitutional reform guarantee the fair value of political liberties? Would constitutionally guaranteed insulation strategies on matters such as public campaign financing be enough to break the vicious circle which leads us back and forth between political and economic inequality, ensuring the fair value of these liberties? And I think you can see the upshot of this question is like, are we looking for a constitution that merely insulates politics from economic inequalities, or are we looking for a constitution that assures that there will be a certain amount of economic equality in our society?
Yeah, those are really good questions. As to the first question, yeah, Brazil and the U.S. are very different countries, and the U.S. has a tradition of military non-involvement in politics. I think I'm safe to say that our Constitution guarantees that that military officers can't serve as civil officers. You can't wear both hats. Whereas Brazil Constitution apparently permits that. As I understand it, there are more military officers serving in Bolsonaro's government than was true even under the dictatorship. So here we're not just in the realm of the non-ideal. We're dealing with very different cultures. In the United States, we have almost a religious devotion to the Constitution of 1787-91. That's kind of the problem. It does. Article 5 is the provision for amendment to the Constitution, and you might think, Well, the Constitution of the United States provides for its own cure its own ills through the amendment process, which involves supermajorities. That's a headwind, that's an obstacle. You might even characterize it as a veto point. But there is one unquestionable veto point in Article 5 of the US Constitution. It states that the equal representation of the states in the Senate cannot be altered without their consent. So citizens of Wyoming have 66 times the political power in the Senate as citizens of California, but that can't be changed without the state of Wyoming saying, oh, okay, all right then. But that's not going to happen. That is a practical impossibility. So the Senate of the United States is the problem here. And it's an insoluble problem because the unequal, disproportionate political power of the small states is a permanent obstacle to reform. I mean, people have suggested all kinds of cute ways way around that. Leave the Senate as it is, but amend the Constitution so that it has no power, so that it becomes a merely ceremonial body. Of course, such a constitutional amendment would require 3/4 of the states to agree to that. And I'm pretty sure that the smaller states would see what was coming there. So we are stuck. The question is, how could we get unstuck? Well, we can't without things coming up unstuck, as in many ways they seem to be doing anyway. And the question is, how do we put them back together again? And that's why I suggest that a popular referendum be instituted and supervised by some respected, detached agency. And what do you have? Well, you look around, and Matt Christman is I think correct that probably the most respected and most powerful governmental agency or agency of any kind within the United States is the military. So I would never, ever, ever propose military involving itself outside the normal processes of government, as long as they're functioning. But what if they're no longer functioning? And that becomes an unescapable pressing reality. In those circumstances, I think rather than scramble to put Humpty Dumpty back together again the way he was, it might be a good time to put to the people by referendum a new constitution that would track as closely as possible the existing constitution. Maybe have to make a number of concessions to factions in the populace. It's not a pleasing prospect, but events may force our hands here. Now, this brings me to the second question, which is, how do you constitutionalize something like Rawls's fair value guarantee of the political liberties. And Rawls discussed this sort of tentatively and glancingly, and in short, suggested two strategies, two types of strategy. One can be called an insulation strategy, in which you sort of insulate money and politics, build a wall between them somehow. And the other strategy is to inhibit the accumulation of excessive wealth as a way of, maybe these could be complementary strategies. The insulation of money in politics is essentially forbidden by the U.S. Supreme Court. If it doesn't look like a quid pro quo bribe, you can't restrict the flow of money into politics. Now, there are various reporting requirements and so forth that do make for trouble for candidates in accumulating the funds they need to engage in electoral politics. But I mean, one can spend all the money one has on political candidacy. Michael Bloomberg, a Republican, spent $1 billion, a bill, in 4 months, just to I guess make it impossible for progressives to get any traction within the party. Just to let them know, hey, I got a bill, just to suck up all the media, all the airtime on the TV. I mean, just, and this is, you can't make a law against this. The Supreme Court says you cannot make a law preventing Michael Bloomberg from doing that. So, I mean, one way of advancing the fair value of political liberties in the United States would be to have the Supreme Court of the United States think again and overrule its line of horrible, poorly reasoned decisions going back to 1976. But so since the Supreme Court isn't going to do that, one could hope to amend the Constitution to in brief, say that political spending does not enjoy the same dignity as political speech. Just say that, or words to that effect, and leave it to the political processes to come up with what legislation seems, to tinker with it, to fool around with it. Under the present reading of the First Amendment of the United States, you cannot even aim for a level playing field. It's not a permissible aim if it involves discouraging spending on speech. More spending on speech, the better. Well, who's got the more to spend? And if your opponent can, blow a cool $1 billion, in 4 months. How much do you think you need to raise in order to successfully oppose that? And of course, Bloomberg didn't get a single vote out of this, but it's not just a matter of vote getting, it's a matter of agenda setting. And certainly the tone of the campaign for the Democratic nomination changed after Bloomberg's blast of moneyed disapproval of the very idea of a progressive Democratic candidate. Now, on the anti-accumulation side, that's more difficult, and I mean, I think, as Rawls says, you can't constitutionalize the difference principle. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't even try to do that. And of course, the fair value guarantee has a prior position. You might do it, have to consider ways of constitutionalizing that. And that can take the form of counterpunching against such decisions as Buckley versus Vallejo, by just laying it down that the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of political speech does not encompass an unlimited freedom to spend unlimited funds in a political campaign. As for the anti-accumulation bit, I mean, there's just no principled way to set a cap on how disproportionate, how big your or small your Gini coefficient is, so to speak. That's why Rawls hoped that the guarantee of political equality would relieve the need to rely too heavily on a distributive principle governing wealth and income. But he conceded that that might be necessary. My suggestion is that, the means of production should not be privately owned, and that kind of wealth should not be in private hands. I think that from the perspective of Rawls's later work, that seems the only consistent way of choosing between the two types of regime he called property owning democracy and liberal democratic socialism, that is, on the basis of which was likelier to stabilize a just society. And I think private ownership of the means of production is destabilizing. It undoes political equality or threatens political equality. So in short, that would be a way of limiting accumulation. Certain types of assets should be commonly owned and subject to democratic control. Unlike the situation that exists, it existed in the 19th century with respect to the railroads. In the 20th century, early 20th century, the automobile industry, as we decided that we were going to be an automotive society rather than a bicycling or horse riding or railroad riding society. And today, entities like Amazon and Google and Facebook have arisen, thanks in large part by generous donation of publicly owned intellectual property to private investors. And now we live with a crazy situation in which we rely upon poor old Jack Dorsey, to deplatform Donald Trump. Now, this is outrageous. This is outrageous, in my view, that things have come to a pass, such a pass that people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey decide what political opinions shall be distributed and which shall not. You might say, well, the worst solution would be for this state to own, for the United States to own these platforms. Well, I mean, the UK survived the BBC all right, I guess. I'd rather we put it to a vote of equals and or representatives that are chosen by a vote of equals than to just say, well, who's, what does Mark think?
Yeah, thank you for the answer. Yes, it does. You always answer. So I think we've went through the main questions about the main subject of the paper. We have now 3 more questions, I think, which are about subjects that you touch peripherally. I'm not sure how you are on time, if you're tired, if you want to stop.
Get all the time you want. I get all the time you want. Okay,
so let's move on now to another question that I did not send to you. And then if we got time, we'll do the other questions that I sent. So this is from Ulysses, and he says, at the end of your text, you state that Rawls was among the first thinkers seriously to tackle the problem of justice between generations. Do you believe that the environmental crisis can be considered today as part of the circumstances of justice, or part of the general facts about the world, so that the parties in the original position, here and now, should take into account in order to establish an additional principle of justice based on the Rawlsian just saving principle to deal with this issue? And if so, do you think that it would be appropriate to state an additional principle according to which, it has 2 parts. The first one says that the regulation of economic and social inequalities must be compatible with the restrictions established by the full guarantee of the basic rights and freedoms of present and future generations. And the second part states that institutional arrangements must be made to ensure the continuity of society as an environmentally sustainable system of social cooperation from one generation to the next. As you can see, Ulysses is very versed in Rawlsian. So the formulation is very Rawlsian.
I welcome that, because we need to take advantage of the opportunity to speak a common language, and that's something that the reformers, I'll call them that, of the 19th century had, that we are not taking advantage of. I'm speaking of the Marxian framework, which sustained argument and thought, whether you bought into it or not. That was how you discuss things for at least the last half of the 19th century. The 20th century, everybody was talking Rawls for decades, not necessarily very profitably, but at least there was a common framework of terminology and assumptions that I think made it possible to carry things further than they have been taken. So I'm delighted that there are people like Ulysses who say, well, let's not get beyond Rawls. Not so fast. Let's make sure that we've got an alternative. Rawls was very respectful of the history of political philosophy. He spoke of the importance of what he called natural piety, which means a decent regard for what other thinkers have said and considered. In academics, since the Second World War, such a premium has been put on novelty, creativity, and originality that the idea of, oh gosh, not another paper on Rawls is disparaged by some people. I think that's a huge mistake. Jeremy Walden, for example, has spoken of graduate students wanting to know if there's life beyond Rawls. Well, what would it be like? Tell you what, why don't we see what life with Rawls is like first? Now, of course, as you point out, Ulysses, the circumstances of justice can't really exist between us and future generations because we can't cooperate with them. They don't exist. So cooperation between people who exist and people who don't exist is simply not possible. And for this reason, Rawls proposed that in the original position, choosers should think of themselves as choosing not just for the person the chooser happened to be or to represent, but to a line, a bloodline, if you like. And there's another formulation, which I think is preferable, is that he proposed that that the choosers select a just savings principle such that they would be glad that prior generations, whichever generation they themselves happen to wind up in, glad that earlier generations had followed. Now, it's quite clear. I mean, could it be any clearer that whatever savings principle that we're observing that's manifested in our collective choices now is not one that anybody living 50 years from now would be glad we had chosen. We are wasting the earth, knowingly wasting it. We can't stop ourselves. We don't have to cooperate with future generations. They can't do anything to us that we will ever know about. We can imagine what they will think of us. And I would hope that all of us will give attention in our imaginations, imagine vividly what the people living in the year 2072 will think of the people who lived in 2022. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Is there a follow? I mean, it's a follow-up. I'm
not sure he has one, especially because he sent us the questions, and although he's here now, he is having some.
Oh, he's not here.
He is.
Okay, that makes it. Oh, he is here.
He is here, but he's having some health issues, so I'm not sure he's on his computer.
Oh,
I think
okay.
he's calling on his phone. So
Okay.
I'll move on to the next question, and if he has a follow-up, I'll send to you by email. So
Yeah,
this one
sure.
is by me, and I have to say this is one of the times I always put a disclaimer. I'm an Aristotelian. I study Rawls, but what I really know, I grew up in Marx, but then Aristotle. So I have a very functional view of institutions. So when I look at law and institutions, I always think that they have a function, and I try to understand how they work. So this is something that occurred to me when I saw your claim about the competitive elections presupposing an unspoken promise of amnesty for the incumbent rascal, however corrupt. And you say that once this amnesty norm is breached, elections cease to be low stakes, and then the orderly transition of power becomes problematic. Now, I certainly feel the weight of your point, and I think that both of us here in Brazil and you there in the US, we're seeing now how elections are becoming tense with discussions of imprisonment, punishment, and so forth. But here, at least, we've always felt this demand, this popular demand for accountability for crimes perpetrated in office. And here's the thing here in Brazil. This is here, down here, this is mostly always about corruption. And this is something that has always puzzled me. Every time in an election, there's somebody who is running on anti-corruption, an anti-corruption flag, which we call it. And that's all this guy is saying. This is it. I'm going to get there and I'm going to clean everything up with a broom. We have this metaphor here. I'm going to come with the broom and I'm going to clean it up. So Bolsonaro ran on this. And we were amazed how it worked. Amazed. It's like, oh my God, it's the 21st century and people are buying this yet. So we have this claim down here, like we need to punish them for corruption. I mean, regular crime, stealing money and etc. And I'm thinking, well, that exists. And then there's something else, which is in our democracies, these people, the elected officials, they certainly enjoy some sort of immunity. But this immunity circumscribes, like while they are in office, you cannot prosecute them for this. But once they leave, it's open season on them. This is why they are so worried. So what I'm asking is, if this is the case, shouldn't we recognize that what the mechanism is trying to assure is merely that these people will be able to govern without having to litigate their way out of accusations and etc. And, not to make sure they're safe afterwards. That's not, at least in this realm, this wouldn't be really part of the democratic game, so to speak. Or do you honestly believe that, like this amnesty clause you're describing, say, no, this is part of it. It's just not, openly stated, but it is crucial to the democratic regime that these people get to leave office and just go home with whatever it is they have done, Yeah.
I'm trying to, I was trying to borrow the ideas of Adam Przeworski, and I'm not sure, because of some of the points you made, Daniel, I'm not sure how far I want to go with Przeworski. Przeworski believed, on the basis of his own experience, and some of it in Poland, I think, during the Soviet time, and in Chicago during the Daley time, Mayor Daley, that incumbency gives the incumbent enormous powers. He was very impressed with the likelihood of incumbents to be able to remain in office. And so the need for a sort of amnesty assurance is going to vary according to the political culture. The impression I have is that Bibi Netanyahu stayed in power as long as he could, solely to eke out that immunity that because he knew that, once I'm out of office, I'm going to be prosecuted. So let me see if I can come up with another coalition. As long as he had a coalition to keep him afloat, as it were, he could stave off the day of reckoning with the prosecutors. So in a presidential system, you don't have that. You don't have that option. You've got to face the voters, and so I think the idea of amnesty during term of office is one thing. Amnesty forever is something that seems contrary to accountability. And if there's no accountability once you get elected president, then why wouldn't you just And actually, after sending you the initial draft of the paper, the cases of France and Israel were brought to my attention. And in both cases, I mean, two former leaders have been prosecuted, and in a couple of cases imprisoned. And yet we think of France and Israel. Well, Israel is an unusual case because of its situation with respect to the Palestinians, but France is certainly counted among full-blooded democracies without making any, currently anyway, any invidious distinctions within its populace that would derogate from its democratic credentials. So democracy is a matter of degree and different degrees of different things. And it's quite an exercise to look at attempts to measure degrees of democraticness. And honestly, I have to rely on the wisdom of a senior political scientist like Adam Przeworski to get an idea of this. My thought is that where a nation has survived prosecution of an ex-leader for whatever, it develops a kind of maybe some antibodies or something, to use an unfortunate analogy, maybe. We don't have those antibodies in the US. So I'm especially concerned. As a matter of fact, there seems to have been an important precedent set in the 1970s that you don't, an ex-president is a sort of a quasi sacred item. It's on his way to the Disneyland Hall of Presidents, and you can't do any harm now. He doesn't have the football, the little case with the nuclear codes. You can't blow up the world anymore. Let's leave him alone. And Trump has I mean, the comparison to Trump and Bolsonaro is just fascinatingly difficult to sort of figure out who's worse, who's more dangerous. There's in a poetically just world, certainly Donald Trump would be behind bars already. I mean, his career has been one continuing criminal enterprise. It looks like to me, could be he's just as innocent as can be. But there's certainly what prosecutors would call probable cause to think that he's committed a whole range of crimes and is probably continuing to do so. Some of them more conspicuous than others. And there's a really intense debate going on in the editorial pages in the US right now. What do we do with this guy? Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, doesn't seem to want to go after Donald Trump. And a number of other voices are screaming and yelling at him, figuratively speaking, to go after Trump with everything, hammer and claw, and lock him up, as he said he would do to Hillary Clinton. Or he didn't. He let his minions make that demand. I don't know. It may be that it ought to be that submitting to a year's imprisonment is a condition of being able to run for the leadership of a country. Find out who's really serious about it, and that would have weeded out a bunch of undesirable characters. Yes, you may run for president of the United States on the condition that, or president of Brazil, on the condition you spend 1 year following your term of office in prison, no matter what you do. Well, that, if they know they're going to go to prison, they figure, well, I'll just do whatever I want. It wouldn't deter. I don't know what you do. I think, though, that and this is my hope for Brazil, is that it's developed an immunity. It can resume the orderly succession of, without military assistance, from one election to another, with it understood that sometimes ex-presidents will be prosecuted. In the United States, I guess a decision has to be made by the Attorney General, and the Fulton County, Georgia, has convened a grand jury investigating Donald Trump's attempt to shake down the Secretary of State of Georgia to change the numbers. Of course, it's criminal. Of course, it's a crime. He sounds like a criminal. It's like it's playing a part. So do you let this go and sort of say, or do you lock him up? I don't know. But it does raise the stakes. And maybe Przeworski was wrong, and it shouldn't be. The rule of law is important enough that there should be maybe a temporary suspension of prosecution and investigation of a leader, a president or prime minister. But after that, it should be understood you're just another person. Maybe that's right.
Thank you once again. So Ulysses has told me by WhatsApp that he loved your answer, just so you know. So we have one more question. Would you like to take another break, maybe? We can go along. Can you hear me, Professor?
Yeah, you dropped out for a second.
Oh, okay. So
now you're back.
Okay.
Now you're back.
So Ulysses has told me that he loved your answer, just so you know. And we have one more question. I would like to know if you want to take a break before, or we can just finish it.
Let's finish it up.
Okay. So this next question is once again a clarification question, but this is once again something that probably didn't bother anybody who looked at your text. But when you began it by saying that blaming populism as the usual suspect for democracy decline, not blaming, but saying it is. And my question here, I don't think it has nothing to do with your claim. It has to do with the fact that I don't know what people mean by that word anymore. This is one among many words that are used in political speech. And when people utter the word, I'm like, what do they mean by that? And at first, to me, it seemed that you were equating populism with popular rule and with democracy when you made the rhetorical question. But then you mentioned Aristotle's quarrel. And then it seemed to me that you were equating populism with demagogy. So, or either equating or seeing it as some sort of demagogy. And I would like to ask you to say a few more words about that concept. How do you see it? How do you understand it?
Yeah. I apologize for just sort of leaving it hanging. I don't think, I've struggled with the definition of populism and sort of reached the conclusion that it means a variety of things. I would prefer that it be used to designate what Viktor Orban of Hungary calls illiberal democracy. That is a democracy where you have majority rule that is so unconstrained that it's free to oppress unpopular minorities. When we speak of democracy, we usually mean liberal democracy. That is not an unqualified rule of the majority as to every subject, but only as to those subjects that are properly put to majoritarian vote. And in the case of Hungary, Orban has more or less celebrated the rejection of the idea that that if you like the sacred cows of the liberal Democrats are to be immune from popular regulation and, if you like, oppression. So that's what I would understand what's meant by populism as it is used popularly, I guess, in the press. And so the reason Donald Trump is thought of as a populist is that he is understood to be appealing to a racist white constituency that's prepared to invade, to use its dwindling majority as to invade the political rights of minorities that are themselves becoming more numerous. That's sort of underlies this kind of "you will not replace us" kind of paranoia. The idea that while we are the majority, we need to make sure that we stay the majority, or we will be swamped or overcome by others. So that's my thinking on the term populism. I mean, I'm simply riffing, if I can use that term, on sort of panicky editorializing that I've seen in the English language press since 2016, or since 2015, really, when it was the Trump candidacy was just beginning to gain traction, and people were freaking out about the kinds of popularity he was enjoying, and disparaged it as populism rather than democracy. I think what they meant was that he was, and I think Trump is actually, while in office, said some nice things about Orban and illiberal democracy, which kind of gives away the game.
Okay, thank you for the answer, for the thoroughly Aristotelic answer, I should say. So I think that's it. We have no more questions. Nobody raised their hands. Some people in the chat saying that it was a lovely talk, and indeed it was a very lovely talk, Professor. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you've had a happy new year. and that everything goes right for you in the rest of this pandemic. We'll make sure to invite you down here as soon as we can. We don't know when that will be, though.
That would be great. I've really enjoyed this. I really can't tell you how much it benefits my own thinking and writing, and I can't wait to get back to the manuscript and fix it in light of the comments and suggestions that have been made. If there are any more of them, please send them my way.
Okay,
email.
I'll make sure to send them. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming. Bye bye.
Thank you.